First story. So, I never thought I'd be that person, the one who has their life flipped over by something as innocent as a work friendship. But here I am, and honestly, I'm still piecing it together. It all started about 2 years ago when I switched jobs. I was hired as a project manager at a mid-sized tech firm. The company had a laid-back vibe, open floor plans, and those trendy, standing desks everyone's so crazy about. I was new to the team, so I kept my head down for the first couple of months, trying to find my footing, learn the dynamics, all that stuff. There was this guy named Mark who sat a couple of desks away from me. At first, he was just another face in the office, but over time, we started making small talk. It was nothing deep, just casual conversations about weekend plans, random tech news, and the usual office banter. Mark was easy to get along with, funny, always cracking jokes, and had this laid-back charm that made everyone like him. We'd go out for coffee sometimes, and soon enough, we'd be having lunch together more often than not. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was nice to have a friend in the office. Someone to vent to when a project hit a snag or when a client was being unreasonable. But slowly, our conversation started shifting. Instead of just talking about work or surface-level stuff, we began sharing more personal stories. Family struggles, past relationships, hopes, and dreams. It felt good to talk to someone who seemed to get me. And for a while, it was fine. Just two co-workers with a lot in common, bonding over shared experiences. But then things started to change, at least for me. I began to realize that I was thinking about Mark outside of work more than I should. I'd catch myself wondering what he was up to, even on weekends. If I got a funny meme or saw something interesting online, he was the first person I wanted to share it with. And then it hit me, I had developed feelings for him. Real feelings. The kind that make your heart race when they walk into the room, even if you're pretending to be engrossed in an email. Here's the kicker, though, I was married. Happily, or so I thought. I'd been with my wife, Sarah, for 5 years, married for 2. We had a good thing going, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. We didn't fight much, we had our routines, and life was comfortable. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Comfortable. Predictable. And then there was Mark, who was none of those things. He was exciting, unpredictable, and somehow always made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was just a harmless crush, something that would pass. But the more time I spent with Mark, the harder it became to ignore. And then one Friday night, after a long work week, we all went out for drinks, just a group of co-workers unwinding. But after a few beers, the group started to dwindle, and soon it was just me and Mark left at the bar. I'll never forget what happened next. We were sitting there, laughing about something, when Mark suddenly looked at me, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "You ever feel like you're living the wrong life?" he asked. The question hit me like a freight train. I didn't know what to say. I just stared at him, the noise of the bar fading into the background. Because the truth was, I did feel that way. But I'd never admitted it to myself, not until that moment. And suddenly, everything felt heavier, my marriage, my job, even my friendship with Mark. I don't remember exactly what I said next, but I know we didn't leave the bar as just co-workers. There was this unspoken understanding between us, a mutual recognition that something was happening here, something we couldn't just pretend away. Over the next few weeks, things got complicated. Mark and I didn't act on anything physically, but emotionally, we were already crossing lines. We'd text constantly, sometimes late into the night, sharing thoughts and feelings that should have been reserved for my wife. And the guilt? It was crushing. I'd go home and sit across from Sarah at the dinner table, feeling like the world's biggest fraud. She deserved better, and I knew it. Eventually, I had to face the truth, this wasn't just about Mark. It wasn't even about my marriage. It was about me. I was unhappy, and I'd been using my relationship with Sarah as a safety net. Mark had simply been the spark that made me realize it. I wish I could tell you that I made a clean break, that I sat Sarah down, had a mature conversation, and we ended things amicably. But that's not how it went down. I hesitated for months, paralyzed by fear and indecision. I loved Sarah, but I wasn't in love with her anymore, and I didn't know how to admit that to her, or even to myself. In the end, it was Sarah who confronted me. She'd noticed the changes, the late-night texts, the emotional distance. One night, she asked me point-blank if there was someone else. And in that moment, I couldn't lie. I told her everything, not just about Mark, but about how I'd been feeling for a long time. It was the hardest conversation I've ever had. We're separated now. It's been a few months since everything went down, and I'm still figuring things out. Mark and I? We're not together. I don't think we ever will be. Whatever connection we had was born out of the wrong circumstances, and I know that now. But I'm grateful, in a strange way, for what happened. It forced me to confront parts of myself I'd been avoiding for years. Life doesn't always go the way you plan, but sometimes, the detours are the most important part of the journey. Second story. I want to start by saying that I'm not the type of person who takes risks. I've always been the responsible one, the person who plays by the rules, makes steady decisions, and follows the path of least resistance. You know the type: steady job, reliable paycheck, everything planned out. That's been my life for the last 10 years, and until recently, I thought I was content with it. I worked as an accountant at a decent-sized firm. Not glamorous, but the pay was good, the benefits were solid, and the job was predictable. I'd been there since I graduated college. By the time I hit 30, I had a decent amount in savings, a nice apartment, and a dog named Milo who was pretty much the highlight of my day. It sounds perfect, right? Or at least close enough to it. But here's the thing, as the years passed, something felt off. Every morning I'd wake up, go through the motions: coffee, commute, emails, meetings, rinse, repeat. It became so robotic that I'd zone out during most of my day. I started having these nagging thoughts, like, is this really what I want? And am I going to spend the next 30 years in this cycle? I tried to push those thoughts away. After all, who quits a stable job in this economy without something else lined up? I'll never forget the day it all came to a head. It was a Tuesday, and I was buried in spreadsheets. I'd been pulling long hours on a big project for weeks. My boss, Steve, came by my desk, handed me another pile of paperwork, and casually mentioned that we were expected to finish everything by Friday. No acknowledgement of the extra work I'd already done, no appreciation, just more. And that was it. The switch flipped. I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. Not the project, not the endless cycle, not the job. I looked up at Steve, and without thinking, I said, "I'm done." He looked confused, maybe even thought I was joking at first, but I wasn't. I stood up, grabbed my things, and left. Just like that. No 2 weeks' notice, no explanation. I walked out of the office and into the elevator, my heart racing like I'd just jumped out of a plane. The adrenaline was pumping, and part of me felt exhilarated. But the other part? Terrified. I had no plan. No idea what I was going to do next. I didn't have another job lined up, no side hustle I could fall back on, nothing. Just a vague sense that I needed to change my life. The first few days after quitting were weird. I felt a mix of relief and guilt. I told my parents, and they freaked out, of course. My mom was convinced I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. My friends were shocked. They knew I wasn't happy at work, but no one expected me to just walk away like that. And honestly, I didn't either. But here's the thing, even though I had no idea what was coming next, I didn't regret it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my life, like I had made a decision for myself, not because it was the responsible thing to do, but because it was what I needed to do. The days turned into weeks, and I started to panic a bit. The novelty of quitting wore off, and reality set in. I still had bills to pay, rent, and Milo's vet bills weren't going to pay themselves. I started sending out resumes and applying for jobs, but nothing clicked. Most of the jobs I found were the same as the one I had left: corporate, soul-sucking, and uninspiring. One night, after yet another rejection email, I sat on my couch, feeling completely lost. I was scrolling through Instagram, mindlessly looking at other people's lives, when I saw a post from an old college friend. He'd just opened a coffee shop in a small town up north. The caption read something like, "Took a risk, followed my passion, and it's the best decision I've ever made." I stared at that post for what felt like hours. It wasn't that I wanted to open a coffee shop, I don't even drink that much coffee, but the idea of following a passion, taking a real risk, stuck with me. I started thinking about what I was passionate about. What did I actually enjoy doing? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I loved photography. I'd always been the guy with the camera at family gatherings, on vacations, at every event. It was a hobby, something I did for fun, but I'd never considered it as a career. It felt too unrealistic, too unstable. But then I remembered that I had already made one huge leap, quitting my job. What was stopping me from making another? So, I did it. I decided to pursue photography full-time. I spent the next few weeks building a website, putting together a portfolio, and reaching out to anyone and everyone I knew who might need a photographer. It was slow at first, painfully slow. I wasn't getting a ton of clients, and the ones I did get didn't pay much. But I kept pushing. One of the best pieces of advice I got during that time was from an old mentor who said, if you're going to chase a dream, you have to be prepared to fail, a lot. But if you love it, failure won't stop you. I held on to that advice through every rejection, every no-show client, every missed opportunity. Then, after a few months, something shifted. I landed a gig shooting a wedding for a friend of a friend. The couple loved the photos, and word started to spread. I began booking more weddings, engagements, even some corporate events. It wasn't enough to fully support myself yet, but it was progress. It's been a year now since I quit that office job, and while I'm still figuring things out, I can say with confidence that it was the best decision I've ever made. I'm not making as much money as I was before, but I'm doing something I love every single day. I wake up excited to work, to meet new people, to create something beautiful. I know this path isn't for everyone, and I'm not saying everyone should quit their job on a whim. But for me, it was a wake-up call. I had been living a life that wasn't mine, doing something that didn't bring me joy. And now? Now I'm finally living on my own terms, and it feels amazing. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that life is too short to settle. You don't have to have everything figured out. Sometimes, you just have to take that first step, even if it scares the hell out of you. Third story. For as long as I can remember, my dad has been a hard man. Not in the sense that he was always yelling or abusive, nothing that extreme, but he ruled the house with this quiet intensity that made you feel like you were always walking on eggshells. If you've ever been around someone who could change the entire mood of a room just by stepping into it, you know what I mean. Growing up, my sister Emily and I lived in constant fear of disappointing him. He wasn't the type to give praise, no matter how hard we tried. I got straight A's, did every extracurricular under the sun, played sports, and even took up piano because I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd say he was proud of me. But he never did. His approval was this thing we both chased, but never seemed to catch. My mom was kind, but passive. She always said that my dad was just how he was, and that it was best not to stir the pot. So, that's what we did, kept quiet, did what was expected of us, and never questioned his authority. Things got worse when I turned 18 and decided I didn't want to follow the life path he'd planned out for me. My dad was an engineer, and he had it in his mind that I'd follow in his footsteps. But by the time I was a senior in high school, I knew that wasn't what I wanted. I was passionate about writing. I'd won a couple of local essay contests and had even been offered a partial scholarship to study journalism at a small college out of state. When I told him, he just looked at me like I was insane. Writing? You're going to waste your life on that? I'll never forget the disappointment in his voice. From that point on, he barely spoke to me. The tension between us grew thicker, but I still went to college. I figured I'd show him I could make something of myself, even if it wasn't what he wanted. But that's not how things played out. After graduating, I struggled. Finding a job in journalism wasn't as easy as I thought it would be, and I ended up doing freelance work for pennies, barely scraping by. I felt like I had let him down, proving him right in some twisted way. And so, the distance between us only grew. Every holiday, every visit home was filled with awkward silences and passive-aggressive comments about how my writing career was going. The worst part? I still lived in that shadow of needing his approval. Even as an adult, I couldn't shake it. I kept thinking, maybe if I just get a steady job, he'll respect me. But the longer it went on, the more I started to resent him, and eventually, myself for letting it get to me. It wasn't until I was 28, 10 years after I left for college, that everything came to a head. I'd been working at a small marketing firm, doing copywriting. It wasn't my dream, but it paid the bills, and I was starting to find some stability. Emily had moved out west for a job and rarely came back to visit, which left me alone with my parents more than I liked. Every time I went home, my dad would make snide remarks about how I'd settled for a job that was beneath me, how I'd never live up to my potential. But this time was different. I had come over for Sunday dinner, something my mom insisted on doing every few weeks. The conversation started as usual, polite small talk, updates about my job, and my dad's predictable silence. But then he said something that hit me like a ton of bricks. He looked up from his plate and said, "I guess this is all you'll ever amount to, huh? A marketing writer?" I don't know what changed in me that day. Maybe it was the years of holding back, maybe I was just tired of his constant disappointment. But I snapped. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and for the first time in my life, I said what had been building up inside me for 2 decades. "You know what, Dad? I'm done with this. I'm done with you making me feel like I'm not enough. I've spent my entire life trying to impress you, trying to make you proud, but nothing I do will ever be good enough for you, will it? You only see the world through your narrow little lens of success, and if I don't fit into that, then I'm a failure, right? Well, screw that. Screw you. I don't need your approval anymore." The room went silent. My mom's eyes widened in shock, and my dad just stared at me, speechless. I had never, not once, stood up to him like that. He tried to say something, but I cut him off. "You've spent your whole life making me feel like I'm not worthy of your respect, and I'm tired of it. I'm not perfect, but I'm doing the best I can, and if that's not good enough for you, then that's your problem, not mine." I didn't wait for a response. I grabbed my coat and walked out of the house, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I got in my car and just drove. I had no idea where I was going, I just knew I needed to get away. For the first few miles, I felt free, like a massive weight had been lifted off my chest. But then, the guilt set in. I'd never talked to my dad like that before, and part of me felt like I'd gone too far. But deep down, I knew it was something I needed to do. I'd spent my entire life letting him control how I felt about myself, and it was time to stop. That night, I didn't go back home. I stayed at a friend's place, unsure of what the fallout would be. I didn't talk to my dad for weeks after that. My mom called a few times, trying to smooth things over, but I told her I needed space. I needed time to process what had happened. Then, about a month later, I got a call from him. It was awkward at first. He didn't apologize, he's not the type of person who would, but he did something I never expected. He acknowledged how hard it must have been for me to grow up with his expectations. He said he didn't realize how much pressure he'd put on me and that he respected the fact that I had the guts to stand up to him. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was something. For the first time in my life, I felt like he saw me as a person, not just a disappointment. We're still not close, and I doubt we ever will be. But that day, the day I finally stood up to him, changed everything for me. It wasn't just about confronting my dad, it was about confronting the idea that I needed his approval to feel worthy. I don't anymore. It took me 20 years to realize that the only person's approval I really needed was my own.